Thank you. Thank you. Well, Tony, thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you for that great introduction. Thank all of you, all the leadership here, all of your support. It's great to be back here. And, man, you know it's a bad election cycle when we are praying for this thing to end. Thank you for the prayer. I feel the pain. I feel you. I'm ready for this. 6 days to go. I'm sure you all are ready for these ads to finish. I do want to give a couple special shout-outs, of course, to all the elected officials, all the community leaders, but certainly the folks that I serve with on a day-to-day basis. Ted Deutsch and Lois Frankel, thank you. I also want to give a shout out to Randy Perkins, who I know is going to make a great member of Congress. Keep protecting our environment. And Tony, you were exactly right. You know, I'm actually more concerned with the two questions I'm getting from these students than any debate I had with Marco Rubio. I'm looking forward to all the questions here. And Tony, you know, in your introduction, you mentioned the United Solutions Caucus. And that was a bipartisan group I started when I was first elected to the Congress. And the reason I say that was because the last time I spoke here, I was with David Joyce, a freshman at the time, Republican from Ohio. And we sat here and sort of had dueling stories about our first couple months in the Congress. And that, you know, spirit of trying to get things done, that spirit of bipartisanship. And it's hard to believe that 4 years has passed since that time, but that same message of trying to reach across the aisle to solve problems is as true now as it was then. And in fact, that's a big part of why I've decided to run for the U.S. Senate. I've enjoyed my first 4 years and 2 terms in the Congress, proud of what we've been able to achieve together as a community, but quite frankly believe we can get a lot more done together by being in the U.S. Senate. And the challenges we face, you know, as a nation are only getting tougher. And I had a heck of a wake-up call when I was first elected. I think Ted and Lois have probably heard me tell this story. You see, I get elected to the Congress, and I'm excited. You know, I got a new suit on, and, you know, they got these, you know, elevators for the members of Congress to go down and go vote, and you go in these tunnels, and I'm there. I don't know anybody, really. You got these little pins you wear, little round, say you're a member of Congress. So here I am in the elevator, I don't know, second week or so. I'm on my way to go vote. Another gentleman walks in the elevator with a little pin on. Hey, how you doing, sir? I'm Patrick Murphy. I'm from Florida. Extend my hand. He kind of sits there like this. Okay, he didn't hear me. Okay, fine. How you doing? I'm Patrick. Still nothing. And I'm like, what's going on? I wear deodorant? Like, he won't shake my hand. And I'm thinking to myself, he clearly heard me. He clearly decided not to shake my hand. Well, that's kind of weird. So anyway, I go vote, and I'm thinking about it. I get back to my office. I got this book of members of Congress, and I'm flipping through, trying to see who it was. Turns out he was best friends with Alan West, the individual I defeated. And he wouldn't shake my hand, right? And I tell that story, you know, it's sad, but it's funny. But think about that for a second. Think of any of you in your lives, in your businesses, in your careers, in your families, anything you've done in life, to have that sort of personality, that sort of hatred, right? That you wouldn't even shake somebody's hand that you don't even know. Can you imagine how you know, tough it is to get things done in Washington, D.C. when that is the mentality of so many folks up there? Now, I'm not saying the U.S. Senate is perfect, right? But I do believe there are more opportunities to reach across the aisle and find some middle ground and actually get things done. And I think the challenges that we face as a nation right now are only getting tougher. You know, think of these cell phones we all carry around and have with us, right? Think about what technology is doing, how it's changing so many of our lives. Automation and globalization. You know, some call it the Uberization of our economy. You know, many studies have shown that about 50% of the jobs we have today will not be there for the next generation because of computerization. Right? Think of how many new jobs are going to have to change. And I believe if we are going to be serious about addressing this concern, this disappearing middle class and income inequality and the challenges that technology has thrown into the mix, we better get really serious about education. Right? And that starts off with investing more from pre-K to PhD programs. They say about 80% of brain development happens in those first 4 to 5 years. Right? Why in the world aren't we investing more in early education and ensuring that there is quality and affordable education regardless of what neighborhood you come from? There shouldn't be a difference in quality of education based on where you're born. Right? Let's invest more there. Let's make sure that our teachers are getting paid more. Let's make sure they have the supplies that they need, right? That they're in classrooms that they're proud of. I was with some teachers from Palm Beach County, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago. They were in D.C. and came to visit and talking to them about, their day-to-day. They explained that they make on average $48,000 to $52,000 a year, and they're each spending about $1,000 out of their pocket on supplies, markers and crayons, pens, etc., for their kids that come without the necessary supplies. And if that's not bad enough, they explained to me the troubles they face and the challenges the students are facing. Because these kids in Palm Beach County now, right, one of the more affluent communities in the whole country, the books that they're reading are so dirty, right, marked up, graffiti, so banged up, that they can't read them often. So the teachers are getting together on weekends, getting razor blades, cutting out the clean pages, rebinding books, and then dispersing them to the kids. But then there's not enough to go around, so the kids have to rotate books on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday schedule. Think about that. In the United States of America, in Palm Beach County, our kids don't have school books every night. Just the fact that they don't have computers and laptops and tablets, they are already falling behind. So we better start investing more there. We also have to make sure that education is more efficient, right? There are opportunities to use technology to our advantage, to make sure we're getting more quality education, that there is a new minimum standard of quality for education. And I'm sure we all went to school or played sports and know folks very well that probably didn't want to go on to higher education, didn't want to go on a 4-year degree. There's nothing wrong with vocational schools. Let's start investing more in vocational schools and trades for folks that want to work with their hands. Let's make sure that folks that do want to go on to get higher education aren't strapped with tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. Right? We are setting back an entire generation right now with debt. If elected to the Senate, I would be the first millennial to serve there. This could be the first generation as well. That is well behind their parents and grandparents because of that student debt. I'm sure there's plenty of folks in here that, had that first loan, bought that first house early on, and they were able to do it because they didn't have $50,000 of, college debt. But imagine the kids that do now, right? They are stuck paying those debts for generations, for decades. We have to, number one, make sure that college is more affordable. We have to make sure that students with college debt can refinance at today's historically low rates. And we can do that. We can make progress there. I also believe that if we're going to be serious about addressing income inequality in this country, we'd better address tax reform. And this is where everyone falls asleep. I know, I get it. But I'll try to be quick on it, but it is important. If elected to the U.S. Senate, I would be the second CPA in the history of our country to serve there. Does that explain a lot with our deficit? I don't know, maybe just a little bit. But we, I believe, need a tax code that is more fair. A tax code that is more simple and more fair for more individuals. Not just domestically, but internationally. Because the difference between the pass-throughs, the S-corps and the partnerships, and the C-corps is huge in our country right now, what the effective tax rate is, but also the difference internationally. And I don't believe that we need to be the lowest tax rate in the whole world. We just got to be in the ballpark. So I support a plan that actually gets rid of a lot of the loopholes, a lot of deductions, exemptions, but brings taxes down to 20 to 25%. More fair, simple tax code that makes sure we are competitive. And I believe that we can do more to create an environment of certainty and predictability that will ultimately help our economy, help reduce these deficits, if we can ensure that we have a regulatory environment that's predictable. We always get in this fight, Republicans and Democrats, of, too much regulation and not enough regulation. It shouldn't be about that. It should be smarter regulations, right? Tailored to the business, tailored to the problem. We have tens of thousands of pages of regulations on the books now from the 1950s and 60s. Have nothing to do with the world today. Right? We can make our regulatory agencies a lot more efficient as well. And we can do that. You just got to be willing to have a conversation about how to improve these programs. Right? Great example, Sarbanes-Oxley. As an auditor at Deloitte, spent years looking at Sarbanes-Oxley. We had to do something after WorldCom and Enron. Right? But what was intended versus what got implemented were two very different things. Right? And you could probably say the same thing about Dodd-Frank. Right? There are so many pieces of regulations and legislation in Washington, D.C. that pass that have to continually be worked on and improved. You see, I believe that Dodd-Frank was a good step forward. Did a lot to rein in some of the abuses on Wall Street. But there were unintended consequences that are affecting the small businesses, right? It's affecting the small banks, the community banks, the credit unions. We got to make sure that we're not hampering those small banks. I saw an interesting stat not too long ago that the big banks, top 4 or 5 banks, have about 40% more market share since Dodd-Frank passed, and there's been 3 new bank charters since it passed. Right? Think of that, gone from about 12,000 banks down to 6,500. Right? I believe we got to have more small banks because ultimately that access to capital is so important for the small businesses, right? For those entrepreneurs, for that American engine where folks have access to a couple bucks for that great idea. And we cannot, hamper that anymore. So we need smarter regulations. Another great example is the Affordable Care Act. Right? It was a huge step forward for this country. 20 million people now have access to health care. But there's things that need to be fixed. If the president himself was standing here, he would tell you all there's things I want to have fixed. Right? So instead of having this, constant debate where some people say, no, it's perfect, don't touch it. You got other people saying it's entirely broken, throw the whole thing out. Let's find the middle ground. We better get health care right in our country. It could be what bankrupts us if we don't get it right. So let's have an honest conversation about how we bend that cost curve. Right? How we make sure more people have access to affordable health care. Expanding Medicaid, for example. 900,000 people in Florida alone would have access to it. Making sure that the government's allowed to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies, right? Help bring down the costs. Right? And these are common sense things, I believe, that we can do simply by working together and finding that common ground. And another area I think that's critical that we need to be looking at and will continue to be critical to me if elected to the U.S. Senate is investing more in our infrastructure. They say there's about $2.5 trillion offshore right now. Some of the largest corporations, largest businesses and wealthiest individuals have their money offshore. $2.5 trillion. Why in the world aren't we repatriating that money? Right? Let's pick a number to bring that money back, investing it solely in infrastructure, roads and bridges and schools, IT infrastructure. Lois Frankel's been passionate about investing in our ports, as we should be. Right? The expansion of the Panama Canal. Florida is in a great location to take advantage of that. We should be investing more in our ports. We should have the best ports in the world. Let's use some of that money that's offshore and bring it back. Let's also consider thinking big for once. Interest rates are at historically low rates right now. Right? Let's have a new deal. Unfortunately, you look at Washington, D.C., you turn on the TV, you read the newspaper. Everything we talk about nowadays is, 6-month, budgets. 1-year budgets. We can hardly even pass a budget anymore, right? 2-year increments. We're living in this constant cycle, this treadmill of politics. We've got to go back to the days where we're thinking in 25, 30, 50-year increments, where we have a vision not just for us, but our kids and our grandkids, where we're willing to make those investments, the investments that have a return on investment, where there is good ROI in education and infrastructure. Imagine where this country would be right now if we didn't build the interstate highway system, if we didn't have vision to build big airports and IT infrastructure, right? Those are investments that actually make sense, that are going to come back in droves to help our economy and help future generations and make sure that America stays the strongest and the best economy in the whole world. But again, you got to be able to find that middle ground. And speaking of infrastructure, on a topic that I care a lot about, I think everyone in this room does, is the Everglades. Right? Think of how important the Everglades is, what a precious part of our environment it is. Thanks to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, it became apparent just how important the Everglades is. And there's always finger pointing and blame to go around for the situation we're in now. And if you want to be honest with where we're really at and what happened, look back 80, 100 years to the Army Corps of Engineers who actually re-irrigated the Everglades. Right? That's what really happened. And I believe we must continually make steps, incremental steps, to help restore Mother Nature's natural flow from Orlando down through Kissimmee all the way down south to the Keys to make sure that flow of water continues to move. And it's not going to happen overnight, but we're making progress. Right? Proud of the work I've been doing with my colleagues in the House on both sides of the aisle to help authorize nearly $2 billion of funding for the Everglades. Right? Making sure that we are moving forward with C-43 and C-44, large water retention areas, helping our estuaries. The Indian River Lagoon, just north of us, is the most biologically diverse estuary in the whole country. Right? Over 4,000 species are there. Yet it's being polluted. You've all seen the algae blooms and what's happening. That's in our backyard. We can do more to invest to prevent that from happening. And even if you're not as passionate about the environment as I am, you care about our economy. Right? Think of how many jobs are tied to our environment. Right? Everywhere I go in the state of Florida, see the very real impacts of climate change and how it's impacting businesses. Right? You go down to the Florida Keys, charter boat fishermen going out of business because the reefs are dying from acidification and bleaching. Right? That charter boat fisherman goes out of business. What happens to the marina? What happens to the restaurant there? What happens to the dive master? The real estate values, right? It's all connected. Right? You go to Miami Beach. I was there a couple weeks ago. Sunny day, driving down Miami Beach, right? 2-3 inches of salt water on the roads. Right? The sunny day flooding. Right? Those roads were not built underwater. Right? Things are changing. We got to address it. Right? The algae crisis in our district on the west coast of Florida. You look at the oysters dying in the Panhandle. Everywhere I go in the state of Florida, see the very real impacts of climate change. And something we should all be talking about and thinking about, especially in South Florida, is the impact of climate change, the Everglades, and our drinking water. You see, that natural flow of fresh water from the Everglades used to flow south, down, replenish our aquifers. And that flow of water would act as a natural barrier to the salt water. Because South Florida, as you know, is all limestone. It's like a giant sponge. So as salt water levels are rising, the water is moving quicker inland. So we are seeing fresh water, historically wells, aquifers, being poisoned now because of salt water. That is no longer being held back because that fresh water isn't flowing south anymore. So there's some real ramifications here of what we've done to our environment that are going to affect so many of us, so many of our businesses, so many of our lives. So we got to do more to address it. Climate change is something we can do more to address, right? We can invest more in renewable energy. We can invest more to make sure we're getting off this addiction to fossil fuels. And the quicker we do that, the quicker we're investing in solar, wind, thermal, tidal, et cetera, the better off we're going to be as a nation, the stronger we're going to be. If we don't have to pay for that oil, then that means we can invest in education and training, right? Whatever it might be. That makes us stronger. So I believe we can do that. And we have a lot of people in Washington, D.C. that continue to deny climate change is even happening. Deny science completely. Like, come on. We can do better than that as a country. You got to look at science. And you don't even need to be a scientist. In many cases, you can look out your window to see the effects of climate change. And another issue that I care a lot about, and I think everybody in this room does, and something I've spent a lot of time focused on, is national security. And as a member of the House Intelligence Committee, this is something we spend a lot of time on. And one of the interesting takeaways I'll mention to start off here is on that Intel Committee, there is very little partisanship. Because it's amazing what happens all of a sudden when you don't have cameras, when you don't have press, you don't have cell phones in a room. Right? All of a sudden, people start getting along. Right? What's that great quote from President Truman? It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Right? And all of a sudden, people start getting along in the Intel Committee. Every day, we're passing legislation. We're making progress. We have very real threats, and we can get it done. So in the Intel Committee, there's a lot that I think we all read about to some extent, but a lot that we better really make the investments necessary to protect this country. Starting off with cybersecurity. I mentioned cell phones and technology earlier. Think about how all of our lives have changed just in the past 5 years alone with technology. You know, how we're so much more connected nowadays. And it's not just us as humans. It's not just our contacts and pictures. It's the military. Right? It's our universities. It's businesses. So much of what we do now is connected. And unfortunately, our adversaries know that's a weak point. And it doesn't take nearly the investments that it used to affect that cyber. And it's a lot easier to be on offense than it is on defense. So as much as we're starting to invest in our military and new pieces of equipment, I believe we better be equally concerned with the investments we're making in cyber, with our satellites, with our communications. because that is a vulnerability, and we better take that very seriously. I also believe that we need to crack down more on terrorism. We never should have let ISIS grow this big. We must go after them where they're at. We cannot allow these strongholds to form anywhere in the world, right? These vacuums. We also must be serious about what we're doing in our homeland to go after these lone wolf attacks. You know, right? Using our offensive capabilities to track them down. Working with our allies. Better coordination. Part of that is cyber, and part of that is finding the balance of privacy. But we can do more to protect our country. And we cannot forget the more traditional threats we face, like nuclear. Whether that's in North Korea, whether that's in Pakistan, whether that's Russia. Right? We better take these threats very seriously. And again, that's going to involve working with our allies, better information sharing, better coordination, and making sure that America stays the #1, security, the #1 national security, the #1 toughest military in the whole world. And we can do that. We can make the investments necessary to protect our country, making sure we're working with our greatest ally, Israel, to make sure she has everything she needs to protect herself. Right? We must continue to build those alliances around the world. And I mentioned Lois and what she's been doing on ports. And, I always have this joke with my buddy Ted Deutsch where any issue he has with Ireland, he comes to me on. But any issue I have with Israel, I go to Ted Deutsch on. But I have some great colleagues in the House. I've made some great friendships and look forward to continuing to work together with them in the U.S. Senate if elected. And one of the things I want to close by saying, because it's certainly, I think, topical with this election and all the gridlock that we're seeing, and I think my colleagues would agree, that there are several things that have happened in our political process over the past several years, decades even, that have led to this extreme gridlock we have, right? Starting off with the money and politics, right? The flood of money. My Senate race, for example, will be somewhere between $60, $80, $100 million, right? One Senate race. My first congressional race was $30 million. That was a 2-year term. Right? Think of that. All the dark money, all the outside groups spending money. It's absurd what's happening. And we have to do more to rein in that money, to overturn Citizens United at a minimum, and get rid of all that outside money. More transparency. Another area that I think has to be addressed and looked at is the gerrymandering of the districts. Just to use quick round numbers here. About 20 years ago, when you looked at Congress, out of the 435 seats, about 200 of those were moderate seats. They could have been Republican, could have been Democrat, just depending on the year. Right? About 10 years ago, there were about 100 swing districts. Could have gone either way. This last Congress, there were about 45 competitive seats. Right? So that's about 10% of the Congress is up for grabs. Therefore, 90% of the Congress is predetermined. It's going to be Republican or it's going to be Democrat. All right, and if you're one of those safe seats, what election matters? Your primary. How do you win a primary? Right? More to the right or more to the left. So there's very little incentive anymore for members of Congress to come back to the middle. In fact, they're more incentivized to go more to the extreme and not come together because of that gerrymandering. So we need fair districts, right? We've got to do more to get more moderate districts so people are incentivized to come to the middle. And we also must, and this is a tough one that's, I think, only becoming more serious, is look at the effects of media on politics. Right? 30 years ago, you get home from work, you turn on ABC, you see the news, whatever, but you go to bed. Here's what happened. Nowadays, you go to MSNBC or you go to Fox or you go to a website or an app that confirms your current beliefs. Admittedly so, I don't go to foxnews.com very often. I just don't, right? It makes me mad. I don't sleep at night. But we're all guilty, I think, in some ways of going to the, websites that confirm our current beliefs. So then what happens? Well, you all become a little bit more rigid. Oh, no, honey, see, you're wrong. Look, I see it right here. And every day you see it and you see it. Next thing you know, you become very partisan. And we're all becoming more guilty of this. So we've got to make sure that, especially for the students, that they are getting as much and as many independent sources of information so they can make a fair assessment. Right? And there's validity on all sides of the aisle for these arguments, but just make sure you're getting a balanced view of what's happening in the world, because so much of what we are reading and taking in nowadays has a partisan twist to it. So My promise to you all is the same as it was 5 years ago when I first started running for Congress. If elected to the Senate, I will continue to be an independent voice for the state of Florida. I will continue to make sure that every single piece of legislation I look at, everything I do is going to be, number one, to say what's the impact of that on the state of Florida? What's the impact on the country? And then how's that sit inside? I take that same approach with everything, and will continue to make sure that I do what I think is best. Don't put on blinders and, listen to all the outside groups and all that. Because I think we can make a difference. And call me naive. But this is a calling. And public service, despite all the negativity and all the nonsense, I believe is a place where we can make differences, right? Where we can give more opportunities to more people, right? And we have so much to offer as a nation. But we've got to come together and find that middle ground. So I thank you all for your support and sure hope I win this election in 6 days. Thank you.